On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, neighborly relations, the Chinese premier in Singapore for ASEAN cooperation. What's in store? And hope for a breather in China-U.S. trade tensions with the Xi-Trump meeting at the G20. What it means for U.S. businesses in China.
Everyone is waiting eagerly to see what happens in Argentina, at the G20 to see if this marks some kind of a turn.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you on CGTN. At the invitation of Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang will visit Singapore from November the 12th to 16th and attend a series of ASEAN meetings. Premier Li is set to elaborate on China's policy proposals for East Asian cooperation, propose more than 30 new initiatives for better pragmatic cooperation under various mechanisms, promote the upgrading of China-ASEAN cooperation, and push East Asia cooperation to new heights. Before we start our discussion, take a look.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang addressed hundreds of Singaporean politicians and business representatives earlier Tuesday. He expressed Beijing's hope to finish consultations on a code of conduct in the South China Sea in 3 years, while stressing that such a deal would bolster free trade in the region.
China and ASEAN countries will benefit in that process. It will also be conducive to free trade and go on to serve the interests of other parties.
Li has also touched upon the recent trade tensions between China and the U.S.
There are no winners in a trade war. We believe the people in both our countries have the intelligence to find a plan that is mutually acceptable.
He hoped the ongoing negotiations could be mutually beneficial, while emphasizing China's commitment to working together with other nations.
Under the changing global atmosphere, we should stick to multilateralism now more than ever. We should uphold the principle of mutual respect. We should treat every country equal, no matter its size. And we should always solve problems through dialogue and negotiation.
He also said China is going to further open up its market. He noted the Chinese government will continue to create a law-based and welcoming international business environment to help boost the country's private sector.
For more on the ASEAN Summit and East Asia Summit, in our Beijing studio, we have Song Qingren, Associate Professor from the Institute of South and Southeast Asia and Oceanian Studies at the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. In Kuala Lumpur, we have Boon Nagara, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. In Washington, D.C., Steve Pruitt, Managing Partner at West Partners. Welcome, gentlemen, to our program. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Nagara from Malaysia, what about the latest for the preparation of the two summits? Will ASEAN be able to come to consensus about where to go, whether it's CPTPP or RCEP? Mr. Nagara.
Well, it's not really a choice between the two. Proponents of both would like to have both at the same time. But I think RCEP is more immediate to the region. And certainly for as far as the completion is concerned, RCEP is nearer to it. So it's supposed to be concluded around now by the end of this year, but I think it may drag on just a bit more.
I see. For the ASEAN countries, Mr. Nagara, of course there are different views, but when it comes to free trade issue, as ASEAN countries are mainly developing countries except Singapore, so what do you think will be the common consensus about that?
Well, I think everyone is in favor of free trade. It's a matter of definition within individual countries, of course, operationally. But I think the concept of free trade is well accepted and established. So within ASEAN, of course, among 10 countries, it's easier to negotiate, as a kind of a grouping. And then with RCEP also, with fewer countries. not that many countries compared to some of the bigger organizations like the EU, where they have greater disagreements on various issues. So I think it's a matter of time before these agreements progress further. So it's not really an issue of major problems.
I see.
Although it has to be said that with the newer kind of perspectives on CTPP, some governments like Malaysia would like to have a closer look again, especially with the new government here looking at the kinds of terms and conditions involved.
Mr. Puit, as you may know, the ASEAN Summit and the East Asia Summit are almost taking at the same place and are almost taking place at the same time, sir, with what's going on at the APEC CEO Summit and the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting. So how do you see the parallel discussion going on there, how they are likely to impact upon one another? By the way, the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting, there will be American Vice President going there.
Well, I think the discussions are probably going to be the same, particularly those that reflect and involve America. I mean, when you look at the discussions that have been going on in America, the fact that we've just completed our national congressional elections, a lot of the landscape here in America is changing. In some ways, not necessarily positively, but certainly it's changing or solidifying, and it's going to require, I think, both bodies to have the same discussion.
Interesting when you are saying changing, but the question is, with the Republican and the Democrat each have one chamber of the Congress, will that make much difference about the earlier policies?
Well, on trade, probably not. I mean, most observers of the development of U.S. trade policy understand that on the Democratic side of the aisle, the leanings are much less trade-friendly than were the trade discussions solely going on with just Republicans. Most observers believe that much of the Democratic leaning leans in favor of what President Trump has been proposing and would support sanctions and other activities, tariffs as well, to rein in not only the Chinese, but by extension much of Asia, because they don't, I think in many circles, don't distinguish between the two entities.
Mr. Nagara, listening to your American colleague, how do you, in a way, interpret the attitude now among the ASEAN countries about trade and about a United States getting ever more, as some believe, protectionist? What would that mean for these economies pretty much on the global supply chain?
Well, the trade dispute or skirmishes approximating to a trade war between the U.S. and China doesn't really help. It does complicate matters, and very unnecessarily things have become more complex. But there have been some saving graces, not much, but we have seen, for example, Japan warming to China very much, and much greater cooperation between the two countries is something to be welcomed, certainly in this region. So I don't really see how the result of the midterm elections in the U.S. can change things substantially. It remains to be seen, because this is something that involves internal U.S. politics very much. Everyone wants to be a nationalist now, including a developed country like the U.S. And as for the real developing countries in this region, we just have to wait and see how a big country like that behaves. Not necessarily to the benefit of this region or even to the U.S. itself. Much of the trade rhetoric between the U.S. and China has been counterproductive. So we can only hope for the best, but we don't really know what's going to happen even in the immediate future.
Right. You see this Asia-Pacific region. Sure, sir. Please jump in.
So that the discussion is not all doom and gloom, I would just like to proffer one potential scenario here, and that is that since the election and with the onlooking to 2020 here in America, I would proffer that there's a possibility here that we're going to move into an era of let's make a deal in America. I think for President Trump, he needs to resolve some of these issues and resolve them fairly quickly. If you look at the U.S. agreement with Mexico and Canada, for example, the changes at the end of the day were not that great, but the resolutions did appear to help on the U.S. side. I think there's plenty of room in the China-U.S. discussion to achieve a similar scenario, and the fact that I believe President Trump and President Xi are supposed to be having some discussions here shortly also could put that scenario very much into play.
All right. Mr. Song, that really requires a judgment coming from China, even about the ASEAN summit and also about the East Asia summit, as well as about a 10+1, 10+3, meaning ASEAN economies plus China, Japan, and South Korea. So what is China's strategic judgment here?
Yeah, I think although we faces the trade pressure from the U.S. side, I think now China also has the how to say the encouraged from the regional multilateral trade arrangement. I want to say that for China ASEAN we have a CAFTA, the China ASEAN FTA agreement 8 years ago, and also now also China and ASEAN and also other regional countries we are talking about to reach the final agreement of the RCEP, and also for China, South Korea, and also Japan, plus ASEAN countries, we are talking about the East Asia trade agreement. So I think now in the East Asia or Asia Pacific region, we are still optimistic about the multilateral trade agreement in the future.
So, Mr. Nagara, here's an interesting thing. How would ASEAN be able to take the best out of all the deals that could happen to ASEAN?
Well, I think realistically speaking, Malaysia or any other ASEAN country or ASEAN as a whole cannot really affect the policies of the United States or China directly. But ASEAN, I think, collectively can make the most of the situation now, given the kind of trade dispute we have between the U.S. and China, to develop this region within the ASEAN +3 framework, as well as within the ASEAN +6 framework, which is basically the RCEP project, and make the most of the situation, and then indirectly perhaps that could provoke in a positive way both the U.S. and China to come to more realistic terms to resolve the trade dispute that they have. So I think ASEAN can have an important role here to try to make the most of its situation in East Asia, meaning Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, to try to encourage both the U.S. and China to come to a more realistic agreement of some kind. I think Mr. Trump, more than anything else, would like to have a kind of a show of an achievement to demonstrate to the American people themselves that he has succeeded in drawing something from China, just as he did in revising NAFTA into the USMCA, which isn't really much of a difference, but at least it is a symbolic kind of trophy that he can show to the American people that he has achieved something. So I think even so, that will take some time for China to digest the proposal that Mr. Trump may provide, and then come to some kind of agreement. That will probably take 2 quarters from now.
Right. And Mr. Song, on the other hand, China and the ASEAN economies are working quite complementary with one another. If you see China's position in the global supply chain is moving up, China is moving more to the service sector, more to the technology sector, and also more to the structural reform of its own economy, which means open up its market, which has been demonstrated by the first ever China International Import-Expo being held earlier in the week. So, Mr. Song, how do you see the complementary sides of China and the ASEAN economies? As a result of that, how much will China be able to work with ASEAN countries, whether on platforms or on real deals?
in the future, China's investment to ASEAN will grow very quickly, and also China's market will continue to be the biggest market for ASEAN products. I think ASEAN's products export to China will grow very quickly, and also second, on the multilateral platform. Now, both China and ASEAN are conducting joint efforts to boost the regional trade agreement and to build the regional economic development and also the integration mechanism. So I think this is a very good example to boost the regional multilateral trade and also economic mechanism.
Mr. Poit, China seems to have very concrete plans for the region. For example, Belt and Road Initiative. Many of those among ASEAN economies actually is part of that blueprint with which partnerships needs to be formed. Mr. Poit, for the U.S. side, and about the future of the region, many wonder whether there is something like a blueprint. If not, how will Washington be able to persuade the relevant parties to be able to work with it about the future, Mr. Poit?
Well, a direct answer to your question, is there a blueprint? I don't see one, and I would suggest that many observers, even looking more deeply than I, don't see one either. I think this administration's trade policies have been more positioning focused in terms of flexing U.S. muscles, economic muscles, rather than focusing on what you're going to do with those muscles. So that's a concern, I think, in many corners here in America. But I think there are 2 points that are relevant here. Number one, ASEAN, in my view, is in a very strong position to change the psychology, if you will, of trade, particularly as it relates to the U.S. engagement in the region. The U.S. can play some significant roles in technology and healthcare and in other sectors of the ASEAN region's activities in ways that China is not yet ready or not able to do today. But secondly, I think because there is a plan afoot, if you travel anywhere in the region, you see that the potential for not only significant development, but also seeing that development turn into significant economic activity is amazing. And I think the Chinese are smart to be there in their current position and helping those countries in the region. I see it every time I go to Thailand, where the opportunities exist for them to really play a meaningful role. And that's going to change not only the psychology of trade, but it will ultimately change the reality of trade and make those countries much more able to engage.
Mr. Nagara, I have to be frank here. For smaller economies, there has to be a process with which you have to work out with some of the major economies. And therefore, earlier question, I want to go push a little bit further. Mr. Nagara, the trade war between China and the United States, nobody knows what will be the result. Nobody knows what's likely to be the process before we see both sides agree upon any kind of end game. So, Mr. Nagara, during this process, which is quite turbulent, what would that mean for ASEAN economies? How would those issues be discussed at this time during the summit?
It has to be said also that no trade war is beneficial to anyone. There can be no winners. There can be losers and relative losers. It's a matter of extent of loss. And as far as U.S.-China trade dispute is concerned, as I said, this is an opportunity for ASEAN to develop its ASEAN Plus 1, ASEAN Plus 3, and ASEAN Plus 6 context. ASEAN and China trade relations have been growing positively and steadily. Last year there was a high, actually, of more than $500 billion in trade. And the proposal or the benchmark really is for by 2020 to have $1 trillion in trade between ASEAN and China, plus of course investments of $150 billion. So I think we are on our way there, even if the exact benchmark is not fulfilled. But at the same time, as far as the trade war is concerned, it's not really good for anyone, although there have been some silver linings, perhaps, in saying that perhaps companies and production centers can move out of China and relocate to ASEAN countries. I think that's fairly limited, and the negatives are probably bigger than the positives.
Yeah. Before that could happen, people suffer already too much. Mr. Song, before we go, I want to have final words from you as well.
Yeah, I think now not only China but also ASEAN countries, some ASEAN countries, also Japan, also India, and also some other countries, Asia countries, are facing trade pressure from the U.S. side. So now it's very now we have the Asian regional countries have a much more consensus that we should make joint efforts and united to develop our regional integration to boost our economy and to decrease pressure from the U.S. side.
Song Qingrun, Bun Nagara, Steve Pruitt, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Insight. Still to come on the program. Hope for a breather in China-U.S. trade tensions with Xi-Trump G20 meeting. What does it mean for U.S. businesses in China? We'll talk to a top American business executive right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you on CGTN. The recent phone conversation between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Donald Trump has given hope to prospects that the two countries can be working together to discuss the way forward, at least at the G20 meeting later this year. China's policy is to stick to reform and opening up, as demonstrated by the first International Import Expo in Shanghai. Despite the ongoing trade tension between China and the U.S., nearly 200 American firms took part in the expo. Earlier, I met Kenneth Jarrett, the president of AmCham in Shanghai. We discussed the optimism among businesses amid the uncertainty. Ken, welcome to CGTN.
Nice to see you here in Shanghai.
Good to see you in Shanghai, finally.
Right.
Yeah. China-U.S. trade relationship. Many wonder whether this import expo is going to send any positive message to that troublesome, to say the least, trade relations.
Well, we hope so. And it could send different kinds of messages, because at the very least, it is an import expo, and we hope that it does result in more sales by U.S. companies, many of whom are here at the expo. Well over 100 U.S. companies will be exhibiting. But in many ways, the lasting significance of the expo, if it's going to have lasting significance, will be a function of what President Xi announces in his remarks, in his speech. And we do hope that he says something about market access issues for companies, and this will allow the U.S. and other foreign companies to sell more into China every day, and they don't actually have to wait for an expo. But it is something that the expo itself is something our members welcome, and it is an opportunity for them in a very efficient way meet with potential customers from across China, because every provincial leader in China, it seems, is here in Shanghai for this, and I believe that they are all eager to demonstrate that China is no longer just the manufacturing capital of the world that exports a lot, but is also a big import country.
We noticed that this time the U.S. administration has refused to send any official delegation. Given the fact of the enthusiasm among the members of your organization, the American companies, there seems to be diverse directions that the business community and the current administration are going.
Well, I would say, for a business show, there's, of course, a lot of pageantry associated with this show in Shanghai, but you don't actually need to have a lot of business, you don't have to have a lot of government officials to have a successful business show, because most business exhibits or shows that take place in China are mainly attended by company executives, and that's really the key. In China, this particular exposition, it does have a lot of political importance attached to it, and President Xi is here, and you have other leaders from around the world. But I would say that, in fact, the key to the success will be the interaction among the business leaders as opposed to the government leaders.
But extended from this question is a bigger question regarding the relationship between the U.S. business community and the current administration. With the debates about the World Trade Organization and the U.S. role differently this time by the current administration, with different kinds of trade mechanism, whether it should only be bilateral, which is the current administration is advocating, vis-a-vis multi-players of trade mechanism and platforms, and with regards to the ways of doing business, for example, using tariffs or not, it seems that there have been different layers from strategic to international and to even the technique of using measures and policies. There have been very different perspectives coming from the American business perspective and the U.S. administration so far. So can help us to understand what exactly is this picture? Are we going to hear constantly very different messages from both sides? Are we going to see a very different approach between the U.S. business community, particularly the established business community, and the current administration? How should China reconcile between these two?
Well, I think you pointed to a useful structure in terms of how to understand what's taking place, because it's true that
within the U.S. side,
that within the American business community, there's been no secret about the fact that many business associations, including AmCham Shanghai, has been opposed to the use of retaliatory tariffs as a way to bring about change. But
it does hurt your members.
Yes. But we need to focus on, so there's a question of ends and the question of means. So here I would say that, so if there's any difference of view between, let's say, our members and the Trump administration, it would be more on the means. But we do feel that the Trump administration is focused on concerns that have been on the minds of our members for a very long time. And these would be, intellectual property rights is, in our annual surveys, always very high on the list of the regulatory obstacles that our members face.
But also many wonder whether the current administration is taking advantage of what you call the ends for their own political ends, rather than the real goals of the business community.
Well, for me, it's hard to, I guess, represent the Trump administration in terms of what its ends are.
Not at all.
Right. But for the business community, for us, we are, so our focus would be on changes that allow improved market access, because, I could run through a list of things that have long-standing complaints, but this has been stated many times. And then there are aspects of China's industrial policies that we feel are unfair to foreign companies. That also is a familiar complaint. And that's why, and these are things that are very much on the minds of the administration. So perhaps what you're pointing at is then what seems to be taking the basket of economic and commercial issues, and it's getting thrown in with lots of other differences between the U.S. and China, and there does seem to be a tension that's building across the board that includes some of the political security issues, whether South China Seas or other things.
Are you concerned about that?
Well,
the apparent spillover effect.
Well, so we would be, but any kind of regional hotspot is potentially a risk to our members. Of course, if you have some connection between what would be viewed maybe mainly as a commercial dispute with a political dispute, particularly over a sovereignty or territorial issue, this is what becomes more explosive. And we've seen examples of this in the case of South Korea or the Philippines or even Japan.
For a long time, trade and economic ties between the two countries have been the stabilizing factor, and very much the stabilizing factor, play a strategic role. On the one hand, this role has been undergoing a stress test. On the other hand, you see the debates about the other issues, as you mentioned earlier, are becoming much more in vision. So as a result of this, will the reality that already the hurt trade and economic ties be further marginalized as a result, and further hurt the bilateral relations, which is an overall vicious cycle that I'm talking about, be a possibility? And to business community, have you ever thought about that?
So it is a possibility, and I can explain a bit more. But first, I would want to emphasize your first point, which is the role that economic and commercial ties have played in terms of stabilizing relationship, particularly at times of tension. So
you don't want to think about the second point?
No, I will come back to the second point, but particularly it's often called the ballast, that keeps the relationship stable. And that's a very productive role, and I think one that can continue into the future, because there are many ways that the two economies are still complementary and can interact to a very deep degree. The reason I would say that we do need to be mindful of a change, which is, if you think back 10 years ago in terms of the complementarity of the economies, there actually wasn't that much overlap in the middle, because China was doing lower-end manufacturing, and maybe the U.S. was at the upper end. And now China has moved very rapidly up the value-added chain, and the areas of focus of the two economies are meeting very much in the middle. And this is why we are seeing this greater friction, particularly on technology issues. So all of the emerging technologies are areas where China and the U.S. are, to a degree, competing to be the world's leader in these areas, which does mean that moving forward, you'll have more of this competition. And competition itself can be natural. It doesn't necessarily mean you'll be an adversary, but there will be.
But it could be.
There's greater possibility for the competition to become tense as well. If in the United States there is a concern about China's growing technological powers, and you sense this in the Vice President's recent speech in U.S.-China relations. And that it does mean that the U.S. government will be more attentive to what the private sector is doing in China, as well as what China is allowed to buy in the United States or invest in the United States out of genuine national security concerns.
But there's always the action and reaction, isn't it? The action could be from the administration and from the policymakers. But the administration is there for 4 years, probably 8 years. But the question is, what about the reaction coming from the other sides of the American society, business community included? Of course, there are different divisions within the business community as well. That's just a reality. Some are having more benefits in the bilateral relation, good one. Others are having less, if not worse. So how do you see that about this part, that the short term vis-a-vis the long term?
Well, the key is to keep in mind that the business community thinks long term. And that's very much, yes, absolutely. And as the business community looks at opportunities in China, and I've been speaking to our members constantly over the last couple of months about the current trade tensions, and try to understand, are there any changes in terms of long-term investment plans and decisions, or how they see the China market. And I'm quite confident in saying that for our members, they do feel that there are very significant macro trends here that make China attractive to them, and that they have no desire to leave. So for the business community, and you can take the import exposition as an example. The U.S. government is not here in force, but I would say that there's a very sizable representation from the U.S. business community. There are, according to the Ministry of Commerce from China, 180 U.S. exhibitors, which out of the 3,000, that was quite a sizable chunk of exhibitors.
Action and inaction could also be a reality for the future. And what would that mean if the business community, besides routinely, quote-unquote, speaking out, without real actions or concerted actions in regards to the current policies, tariffs included, coming from the current administration, what's going to be the long-term impact? I mean, let's just face it, businesses are very pragmatic. If they do not have to speak out, they don't speak out. If they can save their energy, they will use their energy somewhere else. They want to avoid conflicts with any administration because it's not going to be good for their benefits. So are we going to see an apparent appeasement in a way from the American business community regarding what the current administration is doing about the long-term future of what you see? But on the other hand, are we going to see just a few players speaking out? For example, Apple, Starbucks, some of the biggest multinationals. While the other businesses, well, the other members of the business community are thinking differently. I want to get the temperature check from you, Ken.
Well, I don't think that the American business community has been passive for the last couple of months. If you look at all of these submissions to the U.S. Trade Representative, or when they had the hearings on the 200 billion tariffs, it was originally scheduled, I think, for 2 days, but they had to go for 5 days because they had so many people who wished to testify. And the testimony was mainly critical of what the administration was planning on doing.
But they didn't turn back the clock.
Correct. So I think the
Does it mean the business community in the U.S. now is much weaker than it used to be when it comes to its capability of communicating?
Well, I think to some degree the administration feels that the business community actually has been enabling China's economic development, and this is something that they would like to slow down in the areas of technology. So there is a shift in the relationship a bit between the administration and the business community. But the best way really to strengthen and enable the business community would be for China to take some dramatic steps that therefore would allow the business community with much more credibility to go to the administration and say that significant changes are taking place and that the administration should sit down with China and to negotiate a path out of the current tensions.
There were, from China's perspective, earlier negotiations. And those negotiations was almost quite positive between the Chinese negotiation team and the U.S. negotiation team representing the current administration, but it didn't work out even after some of the critical meetings. So it seems that one party of the negotiation is very much afraid that the other party is just not going to abide by the words, not even mention the actions.
Well, at the moment, I guess, of course, we're outside observers to all of this.
Of course. There are a lot of things going on that we might not be aware of.
But until, of course, we have the recent phone call between the two leaders, and that suggests some improvement in the atmosphere. But I would agree that in the last sort of month or two, that it doesn't seem that either government is in a rush to negotiate, for each one has separate reasons. I think in the case of the United States government, they feel that they have the upper hand and that the longer this process drags out, that they will get sort of more from China. In the case of China, they take the position that they don't want to negotiate under the threat of more tariffs, and that the U.S. hasn't shown sort of the right attitude or approach to the negotiation. So you've had a bit of a stalemate, and everyone is waiting eagerly to see what happens in Argentina, at the G20, to see if this marks some kind of a turn in the atmosphere, at least. I don't think, from our perspective, we're not looking for a dramatic breakthrough. I think a reasonable and actually would be very positive outcome would be at least a declaration of a moratorium on tariffs and the start of a process to sort out what a solution could look like.
Right. Before we go, Ken, I have to ask, is also a caution note. How much danger is there that as time goes by, the real fabric of this bilateral relations will be further hurt? The already limited amount of mutual trust will be further lessened. And as a result of that, is there any possibility that things could get better?
Well, here I think it's important for us always to be positive or optimistic.
Oh, yes. On the one hand, yes, but...
Well, even if I think in my own case, because I first came to Shanghai in 1979, so I've been in and out of China almost for 40 years. And in the 40 years, so there have been a number of ups and downs. Definitely we're in a down cycle at the moment, but we have recovered in the past. And what's important then to analyze would be, are we entering a new sort of period in terms of U.S.-China relations in which it'll be characterized more by a greater sense of rivalry or this tension as opposed to what we had seen in the past. But I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. It will take enlightened leadership on both sides, for the two governments, for the business communities, for people to argue and highlight the important areas of cooperation that are essential. So in that sense, we can all be nationalists and globalists at the same time, because in fact we do.
Can we?
I think we can, right? Because there are certain global issues that if we don't address them, they'll be damaging to each country. So it won't be of any use to be a nationalist if you're not working at least on a global level.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.